So the first question that comes up when we start thinking about a church plant is, why a church plant? There's lots of things that you can do with church growth. So why invest in a church plant? Now, if that question seems silly to you, then maybe you don't need to watch this video. But it's not silly to a lot of people because they see a church growth as being a great opportunity to enjoy having a full building and great singing and lively fellowship. And they look at church planting as potentially a dangerous move because we're going to take members who are healthy, active members here at this congregation. We're going to invest them into a new congregation. That might really hurt, and that might be really difficult. So why don't we instead look for a way to accommodate the growth? We can build a bigger auditorium, or we could go to multiple services. Maybe we could build on kind of an overflow area and live stream the message into there. Or I've even heard this one thrown out there. We could just ask some people to stay home once a month or once every other month. Now, the problem with all of these other ideas, in my opinion, is that they're all oriented towards accommodating growth, not towards investing growth. And there's a huge difference. When we're trying to manage or accommodate growth, we're just trying to figure out how to keep things the same way they are, and we're consolidating the gifts and resources that God has given us. But when we choose to invest growth, then we're stepping out in a risk in the hope of gaining a greater reward. So let me ask you this question. If you knew that God was going to year over year over year continue to add disciples to your church, and it was going to grow year after year, say 20%, then what kind of strategy would you adopt? If you decided to figure out how to jam all of those members into the same space all the time, very quickly you would find out that no matter how you finagled it and no matter what you did, you would not be able to accommodate all of the growth that God was giving to your church. Let me tell you a parable. There were two farmers that were each given an apple tree and told to feed the community with the apples. They both went and planted the apple trees. And in the first year, the apple trees grew up and were healthy and the branches spread. But of course, there was no fruit yet to give to the community because they were just establishing their root systems and getting ready. Well, the next couple of years, they began to bud out and get apples. And by the third year, apple trees were growing so many apples that the limbs began to sag underneath the weight of the fruit. Well, the first farmer saw one day the limbs sagging underneath the weight of his fruit. And so he went out to his shed and he got himself some 2x4s and he propped them up underneath the limbs that were sagging. So then the tree was able to rest on that and none of the limbs cracked. But day after day, the fruit got bigger and bigger. And even though he had propped them up, these limbs began to sag and some of them even began to crack, causing damage to the tree and loss of fruit. Well, the second farmer noticed the same thing happening. And so he figured out how, for a time, to prop up the limbs as well. But the next year he came back and he said, I need to figure out how to use the growth this tree is having in order to gain more fruit and also keep the first tree healthy. So he got himself a big pair of shears and he went out and began to cut off and prune several of the larger limbs down to a more manageable size. Once he pruned those limbs, he took them and he dipped them into a little bit of rooting mixture and planted each of those small pieces of a limb into a new pot and watered them every day. And before he knew it, he had 10 more little apple trees ready to go and plant. The first farmer continued to try to accommodate the growth of his first apple tree year after year, and he was able to produce many apples and feed a couple of families in the community. But the second farmer, because he chose to use the growth from his first apple tree to invest in new apple trees, over the course of the next several years, he was able to plant an entire orchard, and he produced so much fruit that the entire community had all they needed, and they even began to send fruit to the next community over. I think you see what I'm getting after here. Church growth ought to be like the second farmer, where when we're having success, when God is blessing us and we're growing and producing fruit as a congregation, we ought to use that as an opportunity to take healthy members and graft them into a new part of our community so that the kingdom can continue to advance. And that accommodates not only growth locally, but eventually it even allows for growth to happen outside of town, all the way across the nation, or even the other side of the world. And that's what we have our sights set on at Cornerstone. We don't want to just have an impact here in our community. We want to grow and invest in such a way that someday we will also be planting churches and we'll be sending missionaries all over the world for the glory of God and the good of his people.